All right, guys. So now let's get into chapter 6, which is talking about gross domestic product. So you have made it through the beginning of economics. So now we're going to finally get into macroeconomics. So the first topic is going to be gross domestic product, which is basically measuring an economy. So when we're talking about an economy, we're talking about a macroeconomy, we have certain goals that we're trying to meet. Not only are we trying to satisfy the unlimited wants with the limited resources, and with that, we have different goals in order to get there. One of them being economic growth. So we really want to grow as an economy. So we want to be better than the traditional economy where whatever you produce you consume. We want to go the step further. We want to be able to make more cars next year so that we can have more resources to make more things so we can satisfy more of those wants. We're trying to grow our economy because we have more people. We need to satisfy more wants. So that's a goal. The other goal is going to be low unemployment and low inflation. So those are the goals. We have the framework where we have the economics and everything that we're going to be learning about in order to get the idea on how we can accomplish those goals. And then we're going to use policy tools such as monetary and fiscal policy, which we'll cover later in the year. Those we're going to use to basically apply the framework into reality. Basically, it's like what we're learning in the classroom in terms of the framework. Let's apply it outside in the real world and see what happens. Can we accomplish the goals? And so, to get a little bit more in details about the goals here, economic growth. The goal here is 3%. So we want the economy to grow by 3%. You may think, well, 3% is not that much. And that's true on certain things, but when you're talking about the GDP of the United States, which is trillions of dollars, and you're trying to grow that by just 3%, it's gonna be pretty difficult. So it's a reasonable goal for sure. Unemployment 5% or less. So 5%. We're getting more into what unemployment is, but 5%, that's a pretty decent number. So anything less than that is going to be fantastic. And then inflation 1 to 2%. That is the goal, is to have low inflation. It is impossible for it to go away. We could have years where we have zero inflation, but we don't have it very often. So the goal is 1 to 2% for sure. Now, what is GDP? Well, it is gross domestic product, which is the value of all the output of the final goods and services produced within a country within a given year. So it's measuring the size of the nation's overall economy. Basically, what's happening here is every time I ask you a question of like, is that included in GDP? Ask yourself the definition. Is it the total value of all the final good and service that is produced in the country in that year? So we'll go into what's included and what's excluded, but absolutely everything is going to come back to this definition. Everything. All right, and the economy's GDP can be measured by either the total dollar value of all the consumers purchase in the economy, or it can be the total value of what the country produces. So basically what's happening here is because we have the circular flow, right, and everything's connected, you could measure the economy by just like how much stuff people are paying for. And you can also just do it by how much stuff is produced. Same idea, right? It's like, well, we needed to produce this much because people were buying this much. So there's two ways of measuring it. And we're going to go over both of them for sure. Okay? But the main thing here is this definition. The value of the output of all the final goods and services produced in a country in a given year. So if we talk about the GDP from 2022, everything was produced in 2022. And if we're talking about the US GDP, everything was produced in the US. Okay? Now, when we talk about the inclusions, we're talking about anything that is a durable good, meaning the things that are long lasting. So the things like a house, car, refrigerator, schools, the things that are lasting a long time. The earth, hopefully, lasts a long time, right? So durable goods. Those are going to be the ones that last a long time, and they're goods. Like we can actually touch them, right? We also have non-durable goods, the things that have short-lived goods, short shelf life, such as food and clothing. Those things really, we use for a bit, and then they either die off like food, or we're on to the next one. So it's not something that's like really like a structure, like a building. Non-durable goods are the things that could just like you could throw away easily. We're also going to have the services. Remember, services are the things that are intangible. So like me teaching you right now is a service, right? You can't really touch the words I'm saying, right? But you are still benefiting from what I'm doing, hopefully. So that's a service. All right, they are. It's a product in which is an intangible, such as entertainment, healthcare, or education. So we are going to count structures as well. So anything that basically you need to purchase and produce and actually make, like a building, like a factory, office, park, right? Those things that take money to actually make and produce, right? The total value of all goods and services produced in a country, right? So if it takes anything to produce it, we will count it. And then any change in inventories will count as well. So when we talk about change in inventories, that's basically where, let's take a business, make 100 t-shirts, sell 50. We have 50 left over. We can use those t-shirts next year. So basically they are goods that have been produced. So I produced an extra 50 t-shirts and I have not sold them yet. So I'm investing in me, right? I'm making an extra 50 t-shirts for next year. Okay, so that's a change in inventory. I wouldn't worry about the change in inventory very much, because if you look at the pie chart there, it represents 0.0% of all the economy, of all the GDP. The biggest one is going to be services. So we do have a lot of different services that people buy. The next one's going to be those non-durable goods. The next one's going to be durable goods at 16.7%, then non-durable goods, and then the structures. Okay, so a big part of this is the purchases on services. Okay. Now, what is excluded? Okay, so this is where it goes back to that definition. Okay, so intermediate goods are going to be excluded. So if the definition is the final good and service, we do not count anything that is intermediate. Intermediate goods are the output provided to other businesses as an intermediate stage of production. So you're not the final user. All right. So these are excluded from the GDP calculation because we want to avoid double counting. What we're trying to say here is that if you had steel, just like raw steel, and steel can be used in a lot of things, right? So we took it from the earth and we made steel, and now we're going to use it for other things. If you use steel in a car, okay, the car company bought steel, all right, and you're like, okay, well, that counts, right? Hold on. If the consumer buys the car, what is the final good? The car. So what's the final use of the steel? The car. So we only count the car, we don't count this. We don't count the steel when the car was being made, we count the sale of the car. We do not want to double count, because if you counted the car has all of the cost of making it, which includes the steel plus the profits. So when the consumer buys the car, they are buying the steel, and we don't. And so basically, if we counted it when the company bought the steel, and when the consumer buys the steel, we're counting the steel twice, and we don't want to do that. Okay? Other things could be flour for bread, right? If you're trying to make bread, you wouldn't count the flour for GDP, but you would count the bread for GDP. You want the final good and service. Basically, we have all the inputs, right? We only count the output. We only count the stuff on the shelf of the grocery store, of the parking lot of the car market, right? We only count the final thing, not the intermediate. So we wouldn't count the tires on a car. We wouldn't count the engine for a car. We would count the car, but not the tires or the engine. Now, another thing is that we do not count any used goods, right? Remember, GDP in that given year, so we don't count any used goods. Output that has been counted in a previous year and then sold again in the current year, not going to happen, right? If the car was produced in 2014, guess when it was counted? 2014. So if it was a used car in 2022 and you bought it, that does not count towards GDP. All right? Any illegal activity, any output that is happening under the table or in the black market where the government doesn't know about it, not going to count. And in fact, right, the shadow economy, kind of like the black market, that accounted for $2 trillion as an estimate in 2013 alone. So it's a pretty large business down there in the shadow economy and the black market economy, for sure. But again, it's not counting towards GDP because it's happening illegally, not with the government's supervision, right? So it doesn't count towards GDP either. We will not count any transfer payments. So transfer payments are where these are payments from the government because basically, like, you're a veteran, you receive veteran payment benefits, or maybe you're retired and you receive a Social Security payment, or maybe you're unemployed so you receive unemployment insurance. All of these things are just transfer payments from the government. But is it for a good or service? When the government gives you the benefits, are they expecting a good or a service to be produced? No. They're doing it just to give you money so that you can go and buy the goods or service, right? So when they actually transfer you the money, nothing's happened. There has been no production that has happened. The only thing that has happened is that now you have more money to go and buy things. That's when it counts. Okay? So transfer payments do not count. It does count when you actually buy things, but the transfer payment itself does not count. Okay? Very, very confusing. Okay? Because when the government says, okay, we're increasing transfer payments, right? Then you think, oh, GDP increases. Nope. Right? Because GDP is the value of all the production of the goods and services. So the transfer payment is not a good or service or production. So it does not count. Okay? So again, this definition right here, very, very important. If you are confused about, like, is it included, is it excluded, ask yourself, is this the final good or service produced in this country in a year? Okay? So we're going to talk about the expenditure approach. So the expenditure approach is pretty simple. It's actually a great idea because what we're going to do is we're going to look at basically everything that is bought and spent money on in the country. So the first thing is, like, who spends money? Households, right? So the people that are buying things because they need them. Who else buys stuff? Businesses. Businesses buy stuff as well because they are investing in machines, they're investing in their business, they are buying things as well. Anybody else buy anything? The government. The government will buy stuff as well. They will be buying buildings, schools, hospitals. They'll do national security. They'll do defense spending. Right? They will be buying things for sure. And then finally, we will be having any spending on net exports. So you will be trading with other countries. So you're buying other country stuff, and they're buying your stuff. They are buying the production in this country, so that counts, right? So what we're doing is we're going to take those four components. We're going to look at everything that the consumers are doing, so consumption. We're going to do anything that businesses are doing, so investment. We're going to do anything the government is spending money on. That's going to be government spending. And then we're going to do anything with net exports. Okay? The government spending does include federal, state, and local. So if we're talking about the city of San Antonio, that counts. State of Texas, anything the state of Texas spends money on counts, and then anything the federal government counts as well. And as you can see here, households spend most of the money. 67.2% of all the GDP comes from consumer spending. Okay? And all we're going to do is we're going to add all these things together, and that will equal GDP. Okay, so again, consumer, consumption, investment, government, net exports. All four of those things are going to be in the expenditure approach. Okay, so if we were to put this on an equation, all it is C plus I plus G plus NX. Now NX, net exports, is just exports minus imports. You're probably wondering, why are we minusing imports? Well, if we go back to the definition of all the goods and services produced in this country, right? Exports count because they're produced here and they are exiting the country. So that counts. Imports, however, are produced outside the country and brought in. So we need to subtract the imports because they don't count. We need to subtract them, and we're going to figure out what net exports are. Okay, so that's why we subtract imports. I like to think about it as this, right? If we were to think about GDP as just money that you're spending money on, okay? If a foreign country is buying your goods, they're sending you money. So in terms of GDP, right, it's like you're adding money to the United States. Imports, you send them money, right? So the money is leaving the country, and then you bring in the goods. So the money is leaving, right? So it's like you're subtracting GDP or money, right? You're subtracting the money from your country. So exports, we're going to be adding. Imports, we're going to be subtracting. Okay? But the big thing here is C plus I plus G plus NX. NX meaning exports minus imports. That's the expenditure approach. This is a fantastic equation to make it simple enough to really understand what GDP is. Okay. So let's take a look a little bit more at some actual data about the different levels of spending here. Remember, we said that consumption is the most we're going to be spending on something, and then we're going to have government and then investment. And as you can see, it does change over time, right? Whether it be a recession, whether it be businesses are in the business cycle, like there's going to be good times and bad times, so spending is going to change. But it relatively, right, it's all about the same. Okay? Now, exports and imports, that's where it gets a little tricky. What are you noticing between like 1970s to today? All right, imports are higher than exports. So that means the United States will buy more from another country than other countries are buying from the US. Now, why would that be? Well, again, if we were thinking about comparative advantage from the PPF, we know that you trade with other countries because they can make it cheaper. And so we buy a lot of things from a lot of countries because they can make it cheaper. And so, and other countries do the same thing, which is why we have exports. Okay. So the United States does spend a lot of money on imports just because a lot of countries can do it cheaper. So you're thinking, like, does this have a big negative effect? We'll get more into that later on in the year, because it does have some effect, especially when it comes to like financial capital, like money, and how that will change the value of the currency. That's where it gets interesting. So another thing about having more imports than exports is that you're really relying on those other countries, and you're not relying on yourself. So, you know, you could be losing out on some jobs here in the United States because you're buying it from another country. That could be it. You know, there's different reasons for why they're good, why it's bad. So, but that's what's happening. It's been this way for many, many years. Imports are greater than exports when it comes to the United States. Other countries, you know, they might have more exports than imports, and that has its costs and benefits as well. All right. So this is what the U.S. looks like. So basically, because the imports are more than the exports, this is where we have a negative trade balance. The trade balance is just that component of the net exports, and basically, what is that net export, that trade balance, right? So exports, imports, where are we trying to get in the balance? If you have a trade surplus, that means you have more goods going out, so you have more money coming in. So it's a surplus of money coming in. So exports are greater than imports. And then trade deficit is where you're sending more money out. So trade deficit is like you're having more money over there. So that's where your imports are exceeding your exports. So we'll get more into the trade balance later on in the year, but I at least want to introduce to you the idea and how it plays into GDP, net exports. Okay? We do have other ways that we measure GDP, such as the gross national product. So when we're talking about gross national product, what this is including is everything domestic and what is produced by domestic labor and businesses abroad in a year. So basically, if you have a United States company in another country, right? So you are still producing United States stuff, right? That counts. So basically, if I lived in Mexico, right, and I was trying to make something for the US, that counts towards the gross national product, because it's, it's kind of like the idea is that even though it wasn't produced in the US, it's still for the US. So it's a gross national product. Net national product is going to be the gross national product minus the value of depreciation. And depreciation is just that process of where something is losing value over time. So you've probably heard how, like, when you buy a car, the minute you drive it off the lot, it loses value. So similar idea in terms of depreciation, in that if you were to drive that car every year, let's say you bought it for $60,000 and you drive it every year, for 5 years later, is it still worth $60,000? Probably not, right? The tires are worn out, the engine's worn out, maybe the color's faded for whatever reason, right? So depreciation. So imagine that, but in terms of a country. So maybe your buildings have depreciated a little bit, maybe machines, same thing. So all you'll take is the gross national product and subtract out the depreciation. We also have the GNP can also be divided into national income. So basically, we could, instead of talking about this from a buying standpoint, where like you're spending money on everything, we could add up all of the income from the country. Because what are you doing with your income? You're spending it, right? So basically, your income is coming from production. So basically, we could add up all the wages and the profits that are earned from your income. We really could. We like to really focus on the expenditure approach, because it does take into account the different countries and the government exports. And the government purchases. It's going to be a little bit more comprehensive in terms of understanding, but we could add up the wages and the profits and all that as well in terms of adding up GDP. Gross national income is the value of all the goods and services produced by people from a country, whether in the country or not. So basically, that goes back to that same idea of, like, if I lived in India, right, and I was working over there, but I was sending my money to the U.S. because I'm a U.S. citizen, right, that's gross national product. Even though I'm living in India, right, I'm still making an income over there, so that does count for GDP. Not for GDP. That does count for gross national income. Even though I'm not in the United States, all right, it still counts. All right. In the next video, we'll talk about the difference between real and nominal GDP. Now that we understand what GDP is, I'll see you there.